As many of you know, we've been covering builds focusing on skills that are changing in Diablo 2 Resurrected's 2.4 patch. Today we do one I've been putting off like the plague, the Warcry Barbarian. This is because I usually prefer a hybrid build with Warcry support rather than a dedicated build. But today we're going to cover it and explain why it doesn't get the red thumbnail unlike our other endgame builds. For this build, the focus is on pre-2.4 Warcry and covering how viable it actually is when fully invested, so we have a good anchor point for after the patch launches. This means going all in, and as such, nerfing ourselves a bit unfortunately. Now, to get a red background, a build has to be able to make its way through all of the key areas of the game, as well as several farming areas, without teleporting or dodging enemies, and do it within a specific amount of time, without needing to fill your inventory with gear swaps. The reason the pure Warcry build fails this is because they rely on these tactics to be successful, especially in areas with physical immunes, something the hybrid Warcry builds don't need to worry about. That all said, this build is an excellent support class for multiplayer groups, since Warcry doesn't need to do damage to cause stun, and it gets a lot of high utility tools to support the team, much like a number of Paladin and Necromancer support builds. But for solo play, at least before 2.4, I would stick with going with a Berserker base with some Warcry to help out, rather than the other way around like we're doing here. That said, let's actually look at this build. For pure Warcry, we actually need to start with the Mercenary, since which weapon you go for determines how you're likely to play this build, and it comes down to a Reaper's Toll or an Insight. With Reaper's Toll on an Act 2 Mercenary, or even Lawbringer on an Act 5, you're going the Decrepify route. This makes the build much more capable of dealing with physical immunes, but results in struggles to maintain mana, since you lack meditation. If you go Insight, you run into far less mana issues, but then you need to utilize a low point Berserk or Frenzy to chip away at physical immunes if you choose to fight them. For both, the obvious choice of a Holy Freeze Mercenary with bumped resist and leech from armor and helmet is kind of a given, but they can only take you so far. The only time you wouldn't want to go with Holy Freeze is if you're building this into a Horker support and need the corpses, in which case you go with Prayer instead to preserve the corpses. Stat-wise, regardless of which flavor you do, this build will end up being a balancing act of energy and vitality. So you get your bare minimum strength for gear and enough dexterity for whatever gear choices you want. If you want max block, do it. If you don't. And then you go to work on finding your sweet spot for vitality and energy. For me, I favored the Insight flavor because it did its job easier with less having to go to town for potions, and I aimed for about 1,000 mana with battle orders, and then put the rest into vitality. This basically gives me enough mana to handle any encounter with minimal charge up time. For the Decrepify routes, you'll likely want to go a bit heavier on energy or invest heavily in potions. For the skills, unfortunately going pure Warcry eats up a lot of points for what it does, a grand total of 80 points in the skill and its synergies alone, with Warcry, Battlecry, Howl, and Taunt. This leaves you very little points to do anything else with. Since for the test runs I need to go through solo, I went the route of 1 point in the wonders of the mastery tree, namely increased speed and natural resistance, and then also plopping in 1 point in my chosen weapon mastery, and 1 point into frenzy with the rest into berserk and letting plus skills take it the rest of the way. This was mostly just to get me enough swings to get crushing blows in on the bosses regularly, and do a little bit of magic damage against physical immunes. You could instead go pure berserk and go with a sword and board or a two-hander option, but that's more for killing uniques than necessarily act bosses like we have to do for this particular type of challenge. If you're playing with a group instead, going heavier into the rest of the Warcries is recommended, with a high level battle orders not only being helping out how often you can Warcry, it also boosts your allies too a lot. Slapping in a point in find item can also be a useful bump as well, and I kind of regret not putting it in this one, but we were just testing to see if this works, not necessarily going for item finding, which you'd have to invest 2 points in that instead of Berserk, you'd still be fine. Thankfully, the gear is a lot simpler for the pure Warcry Barbarian, since you're basically taking the approach of pretending to be a physical damage Nova Sorceress, which works out quite well because their casting animations are actually the same length too. So for weapons, there are a few options, such as Wizard Spike or Suicide Branch, but generally speaking, the best choice is going to be Heart of the Oak. Since we're doing this in softcore, we're going to go for dual Heart of the Oak. This is because it packs pretty much everything we want. High faster cast, resistances, and plus skills, not to mention a nice bump to mana and replenish life. Staying on the plus skills and mana vein, we of course want to be grabbing dual Stones of Jordan if we're focusing solely on Warcry and damage, since this will also give us a solid boost to mana as well as plus skills we desire, since the higher we can get our maximum mana, the more mana recovery we will have and the less downtime we'll have between packs. On the amulet, since I don't have an amazing caster amulet for barbarians, sorry, I just haven't rolled one, we actually went with Mara's, since we'll hit that 105% faster cast through our other gear, so squeezing out a little more here would be pointless. And it does give us some nice resists, and while you could go with a +3 Warcry magic amulet, you'll get a lot more value out of a +2 barbarian rare or Mara's if you want resists and stats. In a similar boat with the helmet, we went with a Demon Horn's Edge for +3 Warcries. Obviously, a +3 Warcry Magic Barbarian Helm with additional +3 to Warcry's tree would be a bit better, though an easier to get item would be a +3 Warcry Delirium for a total of +5, or maybe if you're really lucky, a +3 Warcry +2 Barbarian Rare Helmet with good mods. But all of these are going to be super uncommon, so you likely won't see them in a reasonable amount of time, though you could actually just do a Harlequin Crest if you want something easier to seek that more people are likely to pick up. That leaves just a few slots left. In the gloves and belt, we make up the last little bit of our faster cast to get us to the second fastest frame time, with 20% on Mage Fist, which also gives us improved regeneration, and Arachnid Mesh for another 20% along with plus all skills and a small bump to max mana. Rounding out the mana, we went with Silkweave, though this is the least important of the slots and can be swapped out for pretty much anything you want, since all this is doing is boosting maximum mana and giving us a little bit of mana per kill. And some good caster boots would easily match or beat these. I just didn't feel like doing a few thousand rolls on a D tier crafting slot to get something for a side build. Of course, last and probably the most obvious is the armor. Since we're casting at sorcerer speeds, we have max resist very easily from our skills and gear. That leaves pretty much just one choice for armor, and that is Enigma. It gives us teleport, skills, movement, and strength enough for a decent side weapon, like Berserker Axes. It's obviously expensive, but it works well for this build, and if you're looking for cheap, that's actually what our purple background builds are for. These are more for testing the extremes, and why we have a whole playlist separation. For alt weapons, for act bosses and uniques, there's a ton of options. I went with Dual Death because I had them on here from what I was running previously, but pretty much anything with Crushing Blow or Static Field would work out great, with Bleed being an okay addition as well, but not necessary. And the faster, of course, the better on these. And you don't need to worry about being able to hit with these because Battlecry more often than not outclasses even Conviction for defense removal, meaning even with your crap attack rating, you'll be able to hit stuff as long as you're not terribly underleveled. All that said, overall, Pure Warcry kinda sucks currently. It's not Inferno bad, it's passable, but it frankly isn't even as good as Hydra or Volcano for just general use of getting through the game. It's more for specialist areas. And I would say hopefully with the release of 2.4, we'll see this level 30 skill finally get some functionality outside of these specialized builds that can bring it up to par with the other level 30 skills and make this build move from the specialist gray to the functional red without having to reduce the potency of its main skill.